It's a little bit light on the news right now because of the fact that, the NBA and they're past their All-Star game, the NHL, they're past their All-Star game, and now it's that in-between part of things. But the NFL never stops. So I thought that college football and the NFL were the two that we could focus on today. John, I'm going to start off with college football. The portal is red hot. And what do I mean by that? It is absolutely on fire right now in terms of all these various players choosing different schools. And I thought it was really interesting because here's your top five, John. You've got LSU, an SEC team. Now, LSU is number one right now in terms of what they've been able to garner from the portal. So that's number one. Ole Miss, another SEC team. Now, they also are sitting there at number two. Then you've got Texas Tech. That's a little bit different. You're going to the Big 12. Then you've got Oregon. Then you've got Miami. What I find interesting about this top five is I don't see Michigan in there. I don't see Ohio State in there. Some of the usual suspects, Texas, no. USC, no. So I find that part to be the most interesting part, John, because of the fact that, they're going into the portal. You're looking for a new quarterback. A lot of these guys have had those rent-a-quarterbacks, right? Ohio State's a good example of that. Notre Dame's a good example of that. So I'm just sort of surprised that we aren't seeing a little bit more of that. Now, I did mention Miami, and Miami's number 5 as far as what their ranking is on the portal. But they did pick up Beck from Georgia. So that was a big one for them, and that certainly influenced where they stand right now. But I'm just a little bit surprised, John, that the big boys aren't out there making the moves in the portal right now the way we're seeing some of these. And again, no Bama, no Georgia, really? Tennessee, no. Michigan, Ohio State, no. I mean, that's kind of weird, isn't it?
It is. It is very weird, Pete. But some of the teams that probably missed some people's radar, I know it never misses Pete's radar, but one of the things that I thought was pretty big, Pete, was Oklahoma. They got a guy from Washington State who's a quarterback that did phenomenal at Washington State. You know it, Pete, because you talked about him. His name's something like John Matter or Meter, something like that. The kid lit it up out there for Washington State. He ain't staying. He's going to Oklahoma. Let's see, what were a couple others? There's a USC wide receiver, Pete. Zachariah Branch that's going to Georgia, like you've said. Eric Singleton, another wide receiver, a Georgia Tech kid, and they like big wide receivers at Georgia Tech. He's transferring over to Auburn University, Pete. So there's a lot of movement right now. A big D-back going from Purdue to Oregon and things like that. So Oregon, I just talked about Oklahoma, Georgia, Auburn, Oregon. I think these are all big schools, but not the ones that you usually hear when you hear of Texas and Ohio State and Michigan as far as really using the portal. But now virtually everybody is, Pete. And sooner or later, South Carolina or whatever, Clemson's going to have to too.
Yeah, I love Dabo for what he's been doing, though, John. I love that he doesn't necessarily buy into this whole thing, and he wants to coach guys for 4 years, not have guys just for a year and rent them and another guy for a year. You know what? So far, it's worked for him. Clemson, everybody was saying last year that he's in trouble because he's not doing that, and they still ended up playing pretty daggone well down at Clemson. So it's interesting. It's totally different view than most of the rest of the schools. How about this? As opposed to what we were just talking about, but very similarly, we were talking about that with college football and where guys are going, right? Well, we call that the portal. Well, at the NFL level, they call that free agency. So I just wanted to throw this past you again as far as there's a little bit of a shift with some of the quarterbacks now, John. It's kind of interesting where people are kind of going with this right now. So I thought I'd ask you a couple of them. So Stafford. I think Stafford, the money's going to be there. We know that because we talked about the fact that the salary cap has moved up in a big way, $53 million over 2 years, $22 million over this year. And is Stafford going to be able now to stay and get the money that he wants and he feels he deserves? And I think the head coach thinks he deserves it too. He wants it back with the Rams. So he's either going to the Rams or he's going to the Giants, in my opinion. And I said that before because I think Stafford, with the brother-in-law being the quarterback coach out there, I think that's just sort of a layup if he doesn't stay with the Rams and he decides to go to the Giants, who could turn it around fairly quickly. That would be an interesting one. Cousins, I think, goes to Tennessee. That's my opinion. I don't know that he will for sure, but I think that fits. I think that they won't have to pay him very much either because Atlanta's strapped with that. So that makes that kind of interesting. Aaron Rodgers to Pittsburgh and Sam Darnold. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I think he goes to Vegas, and Pete Carroll is so excited about all the things going on in Vegas right now, the coaches they've been able to get, the general manager, and some of the things that he's been doing. And Pete Carroll, I just saw a video earlier today talking about all the good things that are happening right now with the Raiders. Now, of course, every coach would say that, but Pete Carroll's been around the block. I think Pete's actually very serious about what he sees with the Raiders, John, but he might not be able to get Sam Darnold if you start to see Stafford maybe go, all right, maybe I go sneak around and go to the Giants. Well, you know who goes to the Rams? I think it would be Sam. So a lot of different landing spots for these quarterbacks. So the portal is in college. Well, you got free agency and the quarterback free agency. And he is probably the number one free agent, at least as of right now, still, Sam Darnold, John. I don't know where he ends up, but I think it's either Vegas or the Rams.
Well, I'll tell you one of the things when you told me you wanted to hit this, Pete, I pulled up, which teams have the most people up in free agency? And freaking Arizona Cardinals, I think, have the most. 20 of their players are free agents this year. Now, you probably would recognize these guys, Pete. I don't recognize hardly a one of them, which means, that they've signed a lot of their stars, but they're going to lose a lot of people. Now, just because you're a free agent doesn't mean somebody else will sign you. But that's a big number. Most of the teams, it's somewhere between 8 and 12 to have some team with 20. But listen to a couple of these with Buffalo, Pete. Amari Cooper, wide receiver, of course. I think that's a big potential acquire by somebody. That would fit exactly what you say when you talk about, hey, you don't need to draft or pay a guy a ton of money that's a great wide receiver because there's so many available. Well, Amari Cooper is one of those, Pete. Carolina Panthers have close to 20. Chicago Bears, I think we might be at a record. We might have 22 free agents, Pete. It's just crazy. Let's see, the Cleveland Browns, most of these are in the 15 to 16 range. If you get way down there into like the Tennessee Titans and Washington Commanders, it's amazing how many people like Ertz, for instance, the tight end that came from Philadelphia to the Commanders. There are some real players available, but they don't have a lot of gas left in the tank, Pete. I know these guys are younger than you and me, but nonetheless, when you get into your early 30s, it's kind of hard for those guys to still have the same impact unless they're at a somewhat protected position like a kicker or a quarterback. If you're somebody who's getting hit a lot like Ertz, I don't know that you play a lot into your mid-30s, Pete.
No. And last thing I'll throw out there to you, by the way, because you just brought that up and it makes a lot of sense to tag this onto that. The Minnesota Vikings went from one of the youngest teams to one of the oldest teams in the NFL just in about a 2-year span. And here's another problem for the Vikings. Not only are they one of the, if not the oldest, one of the closest to being the oldest team. Not only that, John, but they are sitting out there right now and they have one pick in the first round, like most people probably do, most teams. They don't have another pick till the 5th round. So they're not going to get any younger either. And so that, I think, is a part of the problem that they've got as well. And they've wrapped up so much money in probably 3 to 4 players that the Vikings don't really have much else out there. And that's the beauty of the draft is those guys, you've got them kind of capped off as young players. But these free agents and so forth that you go out, then you're paying the big bucks. And that's exactly what the Vikings did. But they got old really, really quick. So it'll be an interesting, as we get into the spring and we get into the next fall in the season, be interesting to watch what the Vikings do, especially if Sam Darnold is gone.
Well, that's why, Pete, you and I see like the Rams. The Rams won the Super Bowl just a couple of years ago when they traded Stafford for Goff. And Goff almost got his team twice now to that Super Bowl. hasn't made it over the hump yet, but great quarterback. Love the way he plays. But when teams build just for basically, you're building for one Super Bowl because you've exhausted all of the money and you're up against salary cap on everything. That's why the Rams have been good, but they haven't been able to break through lately, Pete, because basically they were built to win it all, but win it all once. Very few teams are able to do what, again, to give a tip of the hat to Andy Reid and Mahomes and that group, to win it, 3 times out of 5 times that they've been there. That's pretty freaking impressive because not a lot of teams can repeat, period, in any given decade. And for those guys to have 3 wins in there is damned impressive. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.